When Natalie stood up at their father's funeral and said Julia was his biggest disappointment, the room went silent. 200 mourners watched as Julia's face crumbled, watched as she tried not to cry over the casket of the man she'd loved most in the world. Natalie's voice was steady, confident, cruel. Dad always said he wished Julia had made different choices, better choices. Julia wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor, to be anywhere but there. But 24 hours later, in a lawyer's office that smelled like old books and expensive wood, Natalie's confident smile would shatter into 1,000,000 pieces. Because their father had left one final message, and it wasn't the one Natalie expected. Julia Bennett had spent 5 years being called her father's disappointment. 5 years of family dinners where Natalie was praised and Julia was pitied. 5 years of relatives asking when she'd finally do something with her life. But Dr. Robert Bennett had kept a secret that would outlive him, a truth that would turn everything his golden daughter believed upside down. Sometimes the quietest love is the loudest legacy, and today, that legacy was about to speak volumes. Before we dive into this story, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button right now. Because this channel is about truth revealing itself in the most powerful ways possible. And if you love stories where the underestimated get vindicated, you need to be here for every single upload. Now let's talk about how one funeral speech became the biggest mistake Natalie Bennett ever made. The funeral had been planned down to the last detail. Dr. Robert Bennett, renowned cardiac surgeon, pillar of the community, beloved father and husband, had died at 68 after a 2-year battle with pancreatic cancer. The service was held at St. Catherine's Cathedral, the largest church in Greenwich, Connecticut. The pews were packed with colleagues, former patients, society friends, and family members who'd flown in from across the country. Julia sat in the front row, wearing a simple black dress she'd bought at Target, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She'd been crying for 3 days straight, ever since she'd held her father's hand as he took his last breath. Ever since she'd whispered, "I love you, Daddy," and felt him squeeze her fingers one final time before he was gone. Next to her sat her mother, Margaret, stoic and dry-eyed, more concerned with appearances than grief. And on Margaret's other side sat Natalie, perfectly styled in a designer black suit, her makeup flawless, her expression appropriately somber, but somehow still managing to look superior. The service was beautiful. The pastor spoke about Robert's contributions to medicine, his dedication to his patients, his love for his family. Colleagues gave speeches about his brilliance, his mentorship, his generous spirit. Former patients stood and shared stories about how Dr. Bennett had saved their lives, literally and figuratively. And through it all, Julia sat silently, remembering her father not as the famous surgeon everyone was eulogizing, but as the man who'd made her breakfast every Sunday morning, who'd listened to her talk about her students for hours, who'd told her every week that he was proud of her. Then Natalie stood up. She hadn't been on the program to speak, but she walked to the podium anyway, her heels clicking against the marble floor with confidence. "I'd like to say a few words about my father," she announced, her voice carrying across the cathedral. The pastor nodded, stepped aside. Natalie looked out at the crowd, then down at Julia, and something flickered in her eyes, something cold. "My father was an extraordinary man," Natalie began. "He dedicated his life to excellence, to achievement, to making a difference in the world." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. He built a practice from nothing, became one of the most respected cardiac surgeons in the country, saved thousands of lives, and he did it all while maintaining the highest standards for himself and everyone around him. And Julia felt a knot forming in her stomach. She knew that tone, knew what was coming. Dad always said that success wasn't about money or fame. It was about fulfilling your potential, living up to what you're capable of. Natalie's eyes found Julia again. He believed that when you're given gifts, opportunities, advantages, you have a responsibility to use them, to not waste them. The knot tightened. Julia's hands clenched in her lap. My father had 2 daughters. He gave us everything. The best education. The best opportunities. Every advantage a child could have. Natalie's voice took on an edge. And he always said that his greatest joy was seeing his children succeed. But he also said his greatest sadness was seeing potential wasted. Margaret reached over and squeezed Julia's hand, but it wasn't comforting. It was warning. Don't make a scene. Not here. Not now. Julia, Natalie said, and the name hung in the air like an accusation, was accepted to Harvard Medical School, full scholarship, the opportunity to follow in our father's footsteps, to carry on his legacy, and she turned it down to become an elementary school teacher. The judgment in her voice was unmistakable. Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Dad never said it out loud, but I know it broke his heart. He'd invested so much in her education, in her future, and she chose to teach finger painting to 6-year-olds instead of saving lives like he did, like I do. Natalie was a thoracic surgeon at Yale New Haven Hospital, and she never let anyone forget it. At family dinners, Dad would tell stories about my surgeries, my research, my publications. And then he'd ask Julia about her day, and she'd talk about reading time and playground duty, and I could see the disappointment in his eyes, the sadness that his youngest daughter had settled for so much less than she could have been. Julia felt tears burning her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not with everyone watching. I know Dad loved Julia, Natalie continued, her voice softening in fake sympathy. But I also know she was his biggest disappointment. The daughter who had so much potential and chose to waste it, who walked away from a legacy and a calling to do something anyone could do. The cathedral was silent. Julia could feel hundreds of eyes on her, pitying her, judging her. Her mother's grip on her hand tightened painfully. I'm sharing this not to hurt my sister, Natalie said, and Julia almost laughed at the lie, but because I think it's important to honor Dad's values, his belief in excellence, his dedication to making the most of what you're given. He may not be here anymore, but his standards, his expectations, his disappointments, they matter. They mean something. Natalie stepped away from the podium, walked back to her seat, and sat down with the satisfied air of someone who'd just delivered an important truth. The pastor returned, stumbling through a closing prayer, clearly uncomfortable with what had just happened. And Julia sat there, feeling smaller than she'd felt in years, wondering how her father's funeral had turned into a public declaration of her inadequacy. After the service, at the reception at her parents' estate, Julia stood alone in a corner while relatives clustered around Natalie, praising her heartfelt words, her courage in speaking difficult truths. Her aunt pulled her aside and whispered, "It's not too late, you know. You could go back to school. Make your father proud, even now." Julia nodded mutely, too devastated to argue, too grief-stricken to defend herself. That night, alone in her small apartment in New Haven, the apartment she rented on a teacher's salary while Natalie lived in a mansion in Greenwich, Julia lay in bed and whispered to the darkness, "I'm sorry, Daddy. I'm sorry I disappointed you. I'm sorry I wasn't what you wanted me to be." She cried herself to sleep, clutching the watch her father had worn every day, the watch she'd taken from his wrist after he died, because she wanted something of his close to her heart. The next morning, Julia woke to her phone ringing. Her mother. "The will reading is at 10 a.m. Don't be late." Click. "No. How are you holding up?" "No. Yesterday was hard. Just logistics." Julia dragged herself out of bed, put on the same black dress because it was the only appropriate one she owned, and drove to the office of Harrison and Ross, attorneys at law. The waiting room was full when she arrived. Natalie and her husband David, her mother, Uncle Thomas and Aunt Diane, her cousin Marcus, all of them looking at her with varying degrees of pity and superiority. "You're late," Natalie said, though Julia was 5 minutes early. Some of us have important jobs to get back to. Julia didn't respond, didn't have the energy to engage. A secretary ushered them into a large conference room with a mahogany table and leather chairs. At the head of the table sat James Harrison, her father's attorney for 30 years, looking far more serious than Julia had ever seen him. "Thank you all for coming," James said, his voice formal. "I know this is a difficult time. Robert's death is a loss for all of us." He opened a leather folder and pulled out a thick document. Robert updated his will 6 months ago. He was very specific about his wishes, and he asked me to follow them exactly. Natalie sat up straighter, her hand reaching for David's. This was it. The moment she'd inherit her father's estate, his practice, his legacy. Before I begin reading the will itself, Robert left several letters to be read aloud. He was insistent that everyone present hear these letters. James pulled out an envelope, opened it carefully. This first letter is addressed to everyone gathered here today. He cleared his throat and began to read in Robert's voice. Words written months before his death, but feeling like they were being spoken from beyond the grave. To my family and friends, if you're hearing this, I'm gone. And I want to set a few things straight before my estate is distributed. I've spent the last 5 years watching people make assumptions about my daughters, about my relationships with them, about my pride and my disappointments. And I've stayed quiet because I thought staying quiet would protect the people I loved. But silence, I've learned, can be crueler than honesty. Julia's heart started pounding. What was this? My daughter Natalie has told people for years that I was proud of her, disappointed in Julia. And I let her believe it because confronting her would have meant family conflict, and I wanted peace in my final years. But now that I'm gone, it's time for the truth. Natalie's face had gone pale. Margaret looked confused. James continued reading, his voice steady and professional. Natalie, you are a brilliant surgeon. I trained you well, and you've built an impressive career. But you are also the daughter who visited me 3 times during my 2-year cancer battle. 3 times in 2 years. And every visit, you spent more time talking about yourself than asking how I was feeling. You called me twice a month, always with a story about your latest surgery or award, never with a question about my pain or my fears or my peace of mind. The room was dead silent. Natalie's mouth had fallen open. Julia, on the other hand, is the daughter who came every single Sunday for 5 years, even before I got sick. She made me breakfast. She sat with me for hours. She listened to my stories about medical school, about building my practice, about her mother and our early years. When I was diagnosed, Julia took a semester sabbatical from teaching to care for me. She was there for every chemo session, every hospital stay, every 3 a.m. panic attack when I was terrified of dying. Julia's tears were falling freely now, and she didn't try to stop them. Julia was there when I died, holding my hand, telling me she loved me. Natalie was at a medical conference in San Francisco, a conference she refused to leave despite knowing I had days left. She arrived 6 hours after I passed, and the first thing she said was, "I would have been here, but I was giving the keynote speech." Even in death, her career mattered more than saying goodbye. Natalie stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous. He was medicated. He didn't know what he was writing. This isn't legally binding." James looked at her calmly. "Sit down, Dr. Bennett. We're not finished, and yes, this is completely legal. Your father was of sound mind when he wrote this, witnessed by myself and 2 other attorneys. If you contest this, you will lose." Natalie sat down slowly, her face a mask of fury and shock. James continued. "The truth is, I've never been disappointed in Julia, not for 1 single day. When she told me she wanted to be a teacher instead of a doctor, I was relieved. Because I'd watched her struggle through pre-med, watched her force herself to be interested in something that didn't light her up. And when she told me she wanted to teach children, I saw joy in her eyes for the first time in years. If you've ever been publicly humiliated only to be publicly vindicated, drop the word truth in the comments. And listen, this story is about to get even better. If you're not subscribed yet, do it now because you need to hear every word of this will reading. Don't you dare click away. James took a sip of water and continued reading Robert's letter. I made a deal with Julia. In public, I would seem disappointed. I would ask careful questions about her teaching that could be interpreted as concern or criticism. I would praise Natalie's medical career effusively. And in return, Julia would understand that I was protecting her from Natalie's jealousy and Margaret's judgment. Because I knew that if I showed how proud I was of Julia, if I celebrated her choice openly, Natalie would make her life hell. Margaret gasped, "Robert, you didn't. You wouldn't." But the letter kept coming. For 5 years, Julia and I had a secret relationship. A real relationship. Every Sunday, she came to my house. We cooked together. We talked about her students, their challenges, their growth. She told me stories that made me laugh, made me remember why I went into medicine in the first place, to help people, to make a difference, to touch lives. And Julia touches more lives in a single school year than I did in a decade of surgery. She teaches children to read, to think, to dream. She sees potential in kids that everyone else has written off. She stays late to tutor struggling students. She buys supplies with her own money when the school budget runs out. She loves those children like they're her own, and they love her back. Do you know what her classroom wall says? Dr. Bennett's Heroes. She named it after me, after the father who everyone thinks was disappointed in her. Julia was sobbing now, her body shaking with grief and relief and validation all mixed together. Aunt Diane reached over and squeezed her shoulder, her own eyes wet. "The truth is," James read, his own voice growing thick with emotion, "Julia is my legacy, not Natalie. Julia carries my values, compassion, service, putting others first. Natalie carries my skills, but she's forgotten why those skills matter. She performs brilliant surgeries, then goes home and forgets her patients' names. She publishes groundbreaking research, then uses it to climb career ladders instead of to help people. She has my mind, but not my heart. Julia has both." Natalie's face was red, her hands clenched into fists. David was staring at the table, refusing to look at anyone. "So here is what I've decided. My estate will be distributed as follows." James set down the letter and picked up the official will document. He adjusted his glasses and began to read in his formal attorney voice. "To my wife, Margaret, I leave the Greenwich house that she loves so much, along with sufficient funds to maintain it for the rest of her life. The house will revert to Julia upon Margaret's death." Margaret looked stunned, but didn't protest. "To my daughter Natalie, I leave $1 and this message. You have everything you need. You have your career, your salary, your ambitions. You don't need my money because you've never needed me. I hope someday you learn that relationships matter more than accolades, that being present matters more than being praised. But I won't hold my breath." The room erupted. Natalie screamed, "This is insane!" Uncle Thomas stood up. Aunt Diane started crying. James raised his voice. "Everyone sit down. We're not finished." The room slowly quieted, though Natalie was shaking with rage. "To my daughter Julia, I leave the following. First, my medical practice, Bennett Cardiology Associates, including all property, equipment, and assets. Current value approximately $2, $5 million. Julia may sell it, run it, or do with it as she wishes." Julia's head snapped up. "What?" "Second, all stocks, bonds, and investment accounts. Current value approximately $800, $2. Third, my retirement accounts and pension, value approximately $600, $2. Fourth, my life insurance policy, value $1 million. Fifth, my personal property including my car, my watch collection, my medical books, and all other belongings not specifically bequeathed to others. James looked up. The total inheritance to Julia is approximately $9 million. The number hung in the air like a bomb. Julia couldn't breathe, couldn't process. $4, $9 million. To her, the disappointment, the failure, Natalie was on her feet again. No, absolutely not. This is fraud. He was manipulated. Julia poisoned him against me. I'm contesting this immediately. James pulled out another folder, this one much thicker. I anticipated this reaction, which is why Robert prepared extensively. In this folder are 5 years of documentation. Bank statements showing that Natalie asked for money 12 times in 5 years and received over $200,000 in loans she never repaid. Text messages showing that Natalie's communication with Robert was almost exclusively requests for funds or career advice. Phone records showing that Julia called her father an average of 6 times per week, while Natalie called once every 2 weeks. He pulled out another stack. Here are affidavits from Robert's home care nurses, his oncologist, his friends, all testifying that Julia was his primary caregiver and that Natalie was rarely present. Here are journals Robert kept during his illness, detailing every visit, every phone call, every interaction with both daughters. He documented everything, Dr. Bennett, specifically because he knew you'd try to contest this. Natalie's lawyer husband was flipping through the documents, his face growing longer with each page. Natalie, this is airtight. He documented everything, every single interaction for 5 years. James wasn't done. There's one more thing. Robert recorded several audio conversations with both daughters over the last year of his life. He told them he was recording for memoir purposes, and they both agreed. He wanted irrefutable proof of who his daughters really were. He pulled out a small digital recorder. This is from a conversation with Natalie 6 months before Robert died. He pressed play. Robert's voice, weak but clear, filled the room. Natalie, I wanted to talk to you about updating my will. Natalie's voice, impatient. Dad, I'm really busy right now. Can this wait? I'm dying, sweetheart. I don't know how much time I have left. A sigh. Okay, fine. What about the will? I want to make sure you and Julia are taken care of. Obviously, you're leaving the practice to me, right? I'm the doctor. Julia can't run a medical practice. She teaches kindergarten or whatever. Elementary school, 4th grade, whatever. The point is, I've earned it. I followed in your footsteps. I became a surgeon. I did everything you wanted. She walked away from medicine to play with kids, so obviously I get the practice and the majority of the estate. Robert's voice was sad. Is that why you think I'd give it to you? Because you became a doctor? Why else? That's what parents do, Dad. They pass their legacy to the child who continues it. Julia gave up on your legacy. She gave up on our family name. She's a Bennett who teaches 4th graders how to multiply fractions. It's embarrassing. A long pause. Then Robert's voice, quiet and firm. What if I told you I was prouder of Julia than I've ever been of you? Silence on the recording. Then Natalie's voice, cold. Then I'd say you were a sentimental old man who's forgotten what actual success looks like. Look, Dad, I have to go. Text me when you want to actually talk about the will. Click. The call had ended. The conference room was silent. Natalie looked like she might throw up. James pressed play on another recording. This one is from a call with Julia 2 days later. Robert's voice again. Julia, sweetie, did you get the books I sent? Julia's voice, warm and happy. I did. Dad, the kids are going to love them. Thank you so much. You didn't have to do that. I wanted to. You said Tommy was struggling with reading, and I remembered how much you loved those books when you were his age. He's already asking me to read the first one. You have no idea how much this means, to him and to me. How are you feeling today? Did the new pain medication help? A little. I had a rough night, but I'm better now. Hearing your voice helps. Do you want me to come over? I can be there in 20 minutes. We could watch that documentary you mentioned. You don't have to do that, it's Thursday. Don't you have lesson plans to finish? Julia's voice was gentle. Dad, lesson plans can wait. You can't. I'm coming over. I'll pick up soup from that place you like. The chicken one with the extra noodles. Robert's voice broke a little. You're too good to me, Julia Bear. That was his nickname for her, the one he'd used since she was 3. You're my dad. There's no such thing as too good. I love you. I'll see you in 30 minutes. I love you too, sweetheart. So much more than you know. The recording ended. Julia was crying so hard she could barely breathe. Her mother was crying. Aunt Diane was sobbing. Even Uncle Thomas had tears in his eyes. Only Natalie sat dry-eyed, her face a mask of fury and humiliation. Robert recorded conversations with both daughters every few weeks for the last year of his life, James said quietly. Every single one with Natalie was about money, career, or logistics. Every single one with Julia was about love, family, and connection. The pattern is undeniable and documented. He pulled out one final letter. Robert also left a personal letter for Julia, but he asked that it be read aloud in front of everyone. Julia, do you consent? Julia nodded, unable to speak. James opened the letter and began to read. My dearest Julia, my Julia Bear, if you're hearing this, I'm gone. And I imagine you've spent the last few days being told you were my disappointment. I imagine Natalie said something cruel at my funeral. Something about wasted potential or broken dreams. She's been saying those things for years, and I let her because I was weak, because I wanted peace, because I told myself it didn't matter as long as you and I knew the truth. But it did matter. It hurt you. And I'm sorry. I should have defended you publicly. I should have told everyone that you are the light of my life, the daughter who made my last years joyful instead of just bearable. I should have said out loud what I said to you every Sunday, that I'm prouder of you than I've ever been of anything in my life, including my own career. Julia let out a sob that echoed through the room. You chose compassion over prestige, love over money, impact over accolades. You work with children who desperately need someone to believe in them, and you give them that belief every single day. You change lives, Julia. Maybe not as dramatically as a surgeon saves a life on an operating table, but just as importantly, you save children's futures. You save their potential. You save their hope. I became a cardiac surgeon because I wanted to fix broken hearts. But you, Julia, you prevent hearts from breaking in the first place. You teach children that they matter, that they're capable, that they're worthy of love and attention. And you do it for $45 a year while your sister makes 7 figures and acts like you're the one who made the wrong choice. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. So I'm leaving you everything because you're the one who deserves it, not because you need it. Though a teacher's salary is criminally low and I want you to never worry about money again, but because you earned it. You earned it by showing up, by caring, by loving me not for what I could give you, but for who I was. You were my daughter when I was dying, not just when I was successful. And that matters more than any surgery Natalie ever performed. James turned to the last page. Use this inheritance however you want. Buy a house, travel the world, start a scholarship fund for your students, or keep teaching 4th grade and just have a much nicer apartment and a much fatter retirement account. Whatever you choose, know that you're making the right choice because you've always made choices with your heart, and your heart is the best part of me. I love you, Julia Bear, forever and always. Love, Dad. The letter ended. Julia was doubled over, crying into her hands. Her mother moved to sit next to her, wrapping an arm around her daughter for maybe the first time in years. Aunt Diane was rubbing Julia's back, The room was silent except for Julia's sobs and the quiet crying of several others. Natalie stood abruptly. This is manipulation, emotional manipulation. He was angry. He was dying. He wasn't thinking clearly. Dr. Bennett, James said firmly, if you contest this will, I will release all of these recordings to the press. Your father's story will become public. The brilliant surgeon who left everything to his teacher daughter, because she was the only one who actually loved him. The famous doctor, Natalie Bennett, who was too busy for her dying father. Is that the headline you want? David grabbed Natalie's arm. Nat, don't. He's right. This will destroy your reputation. We need to let this go. Let it go? Natalie's voice was shrill. He left me $1. I'm his daughter, too. You deserve exactly what you earned. Julia's voice cut through the room. She looked up, her face streaked with tears, but her voice strong. Which is nothing. You earned nothing, Natalie. Not his money, not his respect, and certainly not his love. How dare you? I'm a surgeon. I save lives every day. What do? You babysit children and call it teaching. Julia stood, walked around the table and stood in front of her sister. I love children who nobody else loves. I teach children who everyone else has given up on. I show up for people who can't give me anything in return except gratitude and love. Can you say the same? Have you ever done anything for someone who couldn't advance your career or boost your ego? Natalie opened her mouth, closed it. Had no answer. Dad didn't leave you money because you didn't give him anything worth paying for. You wanted his money and his name and his legacy, but you didn't want him. And in the end, that's all that mattered. Julia turned to James. I accept the inheritance, all of it, and I'm not selling the practice. I'm converting it into a free clinic for underprivileged children. We'll call it the Robert Bennett Pediatric Clinic. Because my father believed in helping people, and that's what I'm going to do. She looked at Natalie one more time. And you can tell people whatever you want about me. Call me a disappointment. Call me a failure. It doesn't matter anymore because the only person whose opinion mattered left me a letter telling me I was enough. I was always enough. And you'll have to live the rest of your life knowing that all your success, all your achievements, all your brilliance meant nothing to the person whose approval you wanted most. Julia walked out of the conference room, leaving behind a family in shock and a sister whose entire identity had just crumbled. Outside, in the parking lot, Julia sat in her 2008 Toyota and finally let herself feel everything. Grief, relief, validation, love. Her father had protected her, even after death. Had given her not just money, but truth. The truth that she'd made the right choices, that she'd lived the right life, that being present, being loving, being real, mattered more than any title or achievement. 3 months later, Julia quit teaching. Not because she wanted to, but because running the Bennett Pediatric Clinic became her full-time job. She hired the best pediatricians, the best nurses, the best staff. She made sure that no child was turned away for inability to pay. She named the main examination room Eduardo's room, after her first student, a boy who'd struggled with reading until Julia spent every lunch period with him for an entire year. The clinic became her father's true legacy, not the fancy cardiac practice that had made him famous, but a place that embodied what he'd always believed, that medicine was about people, not prestige, that healing was about compassion, not credentials, and that the most important work is often the work that goes unrecognized and unrewarded. As for Natalie, she tried to repair her reputation, but the damage was done. Word spread through the medical community, not from James or Julia, but from family members who couldn't keep the story quiet. The brilliant surgeon, who'd been too busy for her dying father, who'd been left $1 in his will, who'd valued career over family until it was too late. Her practice suffered. Her marriage crumbled under the weight of her humiliation. And she had to live every day, knowing that she'd had everything, access to a father who loved her, and she'd thrown it away for ambition. Julia, meanwhile, thrived. She used part of her inheritance to buy a beautiful house in New Haven. She started a scholarship fund for students pursuing teaching degrees. She traveled during summer breaks, visiting all the places her father had told her about. And every Sunday, she visited his grave, brought fresh flowers, and told him about her week, about the children she was helping, about the lives she was touching, about the legacy she was building in his name. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money. It's validation. It's knowing that the person you loved most saw you, really saw you, and loved what they saw. Julia had spent 5 years being called a disappointment, but she'd spent 5 years being her father's hero. And in the end, that was the only truth that mattered. If this story touched you, if you've ever been underestimated or undervalued by family, share your experience in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Because this channel is about truth, justice, and the people who deserve to win finally winning. Hit that subscribe button and join us for the next incredible story.